The world lost its way between 1939 and 1945. Over 70 million people died. That number is so large, it becomes meaningless. It's just a statistic. It's hard to imagine 70 million individual lives, each with a family, a favorite food, a memory of their first love. The chaos was everywhere. Cities turned to dust. Entire populations were targeted for erasure. It was a time that tested the very idea of what it means to be human. When faced with total darkness, does the light of humanity go out completely? Or does it just become easier to see the sparks? This isn't a story about the grand strategies or the turning points of the battles. It's not about the machines of war or the politics of power. This is about the people on the ground, the ones caught in the storm. It's about the small, quiet moments that tell a larger truth, the moments when someone chose kindness over cruelty, courage over fear, and connection over division. These moments didn't stop the war, they didn't save the world, but they did save a piece of our soul. They proved that even in the deepest pit of human depravity, goodness could still exist. It wasn't loud. It was often a whisper, but it was there, and it's a whisper we need to hear today more than ever. What makes a person risk their life for a stranger? What makes an enemy see a human being instead of a target? Number 18. Why did a man groomed for supremacy help his rival? It was August 1936. The Olympic Games were being held in Berlin, the capital of a regime built on a twisted ideology of racial purity and dominance. The air was thick with propaganda. The message was clear. Their athletes were superior. They were destined to win. And for a moment, it looked like one of their biggest rivals was about to fail. Jesse Owens, a black American athlete, was competing in the long jump. The pressure was immense. He was the man everyone was watching. He was the living counter-argument to the regime's hateful narrative. On his first two attempts, he fouled. He stepped over the line. One more foul and he would be eliminated. His dream of Olympic gold would be over. The crowd, loyal to the home country, roared with approval. Then something unexpected happened. A German long jumper named Luz Long walked over to Owens. Long was the classic image of the athlete the regime promoted. He was tall, blonde, and blue-eyed. He was Owens' main competition. By all accounts, he should have wanted Owens to fail. But he didn't. Luz Long spoke to Jesse Owens. He suggested that Owens make his mark a few inches behind the board. That way, even if he went a little over, he wouldn't foul. It was a simple piece of advice, a small act of sportsmanship. Owens took the advice. He qualified easily on his next jump. Later that day, Jesse Owens would go on to win the gold medal, setting a new Olympic record. The first person to congratulate him, right there in front of the regime's leaders, was Luz Long. He shook Owens' hand. He hugged him. A photograph captured the moment. A black man and a German man, arms around each other, smiling. It was an image of pure humanity that flew in the face of everything the state stood for. In his book, The Jesse Owens Story, Owens later wrote about that moment. He said, "It took a lot of courage for him to befriend me in front of all those people. You could melt down all the medals and cups I have, and they wouldn't be a plating on the 24-karat friendship I felt for Luz Long at that moment." They remained friends, writing letters to each other even after the war began. Luz Long would later join the German army. He was killed in action in Italy in 1943. His last letter to Owens asked him to one day find his son and tell him about their friendship, about a time when war and hate hadn't yet consumed the world. Owens did just that. This moment happened before the first shots of the war were fired, but it was a profound act of resistance against the ideology that would soon drag the world into chaos. It was a statement that our shared humanity is more important than the flags we wave or the uniforms we wear, but so much of their story remains a mystery. We have Owens' account, but what was going through Luz Long's mind? Was his action purely sportsmanship, or was it a deliberate political statement? Did he face any reprimand from his superiors for his public display of friendship with Owens? And what became of the other letters they supposedly exchanged? The ones lost to the chaos of war, filled with thoughts we can now only guess at. Number 17. When the enemy is a starving child, what does a soldier do? The war was a machine that ran on hate. Soldiers were trained to see the other side as a faceless enemy. Dehumanization is a necessary tool of conflict. You can't ask a man to kill another man if he sees him as a father, a son, or a brother. He has to be a target, an objective, a thing. But the reality on the ground was always more complicated. The lines drawn on maps were clear. The lines in the human heart were not. This was especially true when soldiers came face to face with civilians, especially children. There are countless photographs from the war that tell this story. A soldier in a U.S. Army uniform kneels down, sharing his chocolate bar with a small, ragged German girl. An Allied serviceman gives a piece of bread to an orphaned Japanese boy whose city has been turned to rubble. A Soviet soldier lifts a liberated child from a concentration camp, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. These were not sanctioned acts of war, they were spontaneous acts of compassion. They were moments when the programming of a soldier failed and the instinct of a human being took over. One famous story comes from the Battle of Okinawa in 1945. It was one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific. The fighting was brutal and relentless. The U.S. Marines were ordered to clear out caves where opposing soldiers were hiding. But the caves also held civilians, terrified families hiding from the crossfire. A war correspondent named Eugene Smith was there. He photographed a Marine finding a baby, barely alive, lying next to its dead mother. The Marine, a young man who had just been in a firefight for his life, gently picked up the infant and carried it to safety. Smith's photograph of that moment is a stunning depiction of tenderness in the middle of hell. The soldier's hands, trained to hold a rifle, were instead cradling a life. These actions were not universal. The war was full of unimaginable cruelty, but the fact that these moments of kindness happened at all is remarkable. These soldiers had every reason to be bitter and hateful. They had seen their friends die. They were exhausted, scared, and far from home. And yet, when they saw a hungry child, something inside them clicked. The enemy disappeared. They just saw a child. The historian Stephen Ambrose, in his book Citizen Soldiers, details many such small interactions. He notes that for many American GIs, giving candy or rations to local children was one of the few things that made them feel human again. It was a way to connect with the world they had left behind, a world where you helped people instead of hurting them. These small acts didn't change the outcome of the war. They didn't bring peace any sooner, but they saved something just as important. They saved the individual soldier's humanity. They were a reminder that even when you are forced to be a warrior, you don't have to become a monster. But how many of these acts went unrecorded? How many soldiers performed an act of kindness, only to be killed moments later, their story dying with them? We see the photos, but we don't know the names. What happened to that Marine from Okinawa or the child he saved? And the most unsettling question of all, how many soldiers, after sharing their food with the child, were then forced to pick up their rifle and continue fighting, holding two completely opposite realities in their mind at the same time? Number 16. How does an entire village agree to risk everything for strangers? In the mountains of southern France, there is a small village called Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. It was a quiet place, mostly populated by Protestant farmers. During the war, this village became one of the most remarkable havens of hope on the entire continent. The people of Le Chambon and the surrounding villages decided to do something extraordinary. They decided to save people who were being hunted by the occupying forces and their collaborators. They did it quietly, consistently, and at immense personal risk. It wasn't an organized resistance with guns and codes. It was a conspiracy of goodness. The effort was led by the village pastor, André Trocmy, and his wife, Magda. When the authorities came to him and demanded he turn over the lists of refugees he was hiding, he refused. He told them, "We do not know what a Jew is. We only know men." That was the guiding principle of the entire village. They didn't see people as labels. They saw them as human beings in need of help. The system was simple. When a family fleeing persecution arrived, they would be given shelter. They were hidden in private homes and farms on the mountain. Local schools took in the children, enrolling them under false names. The whole community was in on it. The farmers provided food. The teachers provided education. The doctors provided medical care. Everyone played a part. If a police raid was imminent, the children would be sent into the woods to pick mushrooms until the danger passed. It is estimated that the village of Les Chambon, with a population of only a few thousand, saved the lives of as many as 5,000 refugees, including many children. This wasn't an easy choice. The punishment for hiding fugitives was severe. It could mean imprisonment, deportation to a labor camp, or even death. And the villagers knew this. Pastor Trocmy himself was arrested several times. His cousin, Daniel Trocmy, who ran a children's home, was arrested and sent to a concentration camp where he was murdered. Still, they did not stop. Their faith and their conscience told them it was the right thing to do. In the book Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed by Philip Halley, he explores the motivations of the villagers. He found it wasn't a grand, heroic gesture in their minds. To them, it was just simple, decent human behavior. When asked why they did it, the most common answer was, it was the human thing to do. The story of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon is powerful because it wasn't the work of one hero. It was the work of an entire community. It was a collective act of courage. It showed that a group of ordinary people, farmers and teachers and pastors, could stand up to a murderous regime, not with weapons, but with compassion and solidarity. They built a shield of kindness that protected thousands. But what was the secret of their unity? In a world torn apart by betrayal, how did an entire village maintain such a powerful, unspoken pact of silence and support? Were there moments of doubt or internal conflict that we have no record of? And how many other smaller Lee Shambins existed across Europe? Their stories lost to time because their conspiracy of goodness was so successful that it left no trace. Number 15. What makes a nation act as one to save its neighbors? In the autumn of 1943, Denmark was under occupation. The situation for the country's Jewish population, which had so far been relatively safe, suddenly became dire. The order came down from the occupying forces all Jews in Denmark were to be rounded up and deported to concentration camps. The date was set for the night of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. It was a plan designed for maximum efficiency, a cold, bureaucratic blueprint for mass murder. But it failed. It failed because of the actions of thousands of ordinary Danish people. The story of the rescue of the Danish Jews is unique. It wasn't a small group of brave individuals. It was a spontaneous nationwide effort. The news of the impending roundup was leaked by a German diplomat, George Ferdinand Duckwitz, to Danish politicians. The politicians then warned the leaders of the Jewish community. The news spread like wildfire. The chief rabbi of Copenhagen, Marcus Melchior, told his congregation to cancel the New Year services and go into hiding. And then the Danish people took over. It was a remarkable grassroots movement. Doctors and nurses began admitting Jewish patients to hospitals, hiding them under false names and diagnoses. Taxi drivers gave free rides to help people escape. University students helped guide families through the darkened streets. But the most crucial part was the escape to neutral Sweden. The only way was across the Øresund, the narrow strait of water separating the two countries. An entire flotilla of private boats was mobilized. Fishermen, who knew the waters and the patrol schedules of the German Navy, became the heroes of the hour. They hid families in the holds of their fishing boats, covering them with nets and fish, and sailed them across the water under the cover of darkness. The risks were enormous. The German patrols were a constant threat, but the fishermen did it anyway. People from all walks of life helped pay for the crossings. The rich donated money. The poor gave what they could. It was a national conspiracy of decency. Within a few weeks, over 7,200 of Denmark's 7,800 Jews had been safely smuggled to Sweden. That's more than 90% of the entire population. It was the single most effective act of collective resistance to the persecution in all of occupied Europe. The historian Leni Yahil, in her book The Rescue of Danish Jewry Test of a People, argues that it was the Danish people's strong sense of national identity and democratic values that fueled the rescue. They didn't see their Jewish neighbors as other. They saw them as fellow Danes. The story is a powerful testament to what can happen when a society refuses to be complicit. It shows that when people choose to act together, they can thwart even the most organized and ruthless of plans. It was a moment when a country's moral compass pointed true north, and its people followed. But what about the German officials who looked the other way? We know about Duckwitz, but were there others? How many German soldiers and sailors intentionally failed to spot a fishing boat slipping through the darkness, their small act of insubordination unrecorded? And what was the true cost for the fishermen and their families? We celebrate the success, but we often forget the terror they must have felt on every single crossing. Number 14. Who volunteers to enter hell? The stories of escape from the war's most horrific places are legendary. People risked everything to get out of the ghettos, the labor camps, the death camps. But what about the story of someone who volunteered to go? And in 1940, the Polish resistance was desperate for reliable information about a new concentration camp that had been established in occupied Poland. It was a place of rumors and whispers, a black hole from which no information seemed to escape. They needed to know what was happening inside. They needed a witness. A young Polish army officer named Witold Pilecki stepped forward. He had a daring, almost insane plan. he would intentionally get himself arrested and sent to the camp. His mission to organize a resistance cell inside the wire, gather intelligence, and send reports back to the outside world. It was, for all intents and purposes, a suicide mission. In September 1940, during a street roundup in Warsaw, Pilecki allowed himself to be caught. He was sent to the camp known as Auschwitz. For the next 2.5 years, Pilecki endured the unimaginable horrors of the camp. He survived starvation, disease, and the constant brutality of the guards, but he did more than just survive. He fulfilled his mission. He created an underground organization inside the camp, the Związek Organizacji Wojskowej ZOW. The ZOW worked to improve morale, distribute extra food and clothing, and, most importantly, gather intelligence. Pilecki and his network documented the systematic extermination taking place. They recorded the numbers of transports arriving, the methods of killing, and the sheer scale of the industrialized murder. Using a network of couriers and sympathizers, Pilecki managed to smuggle his reports out of the camp. These reports were some of the first and most detailed eyewitness accounts of the atrocities to reach the Western Allies. They were a desperate plea for help, a cry from the heart of darkness. For a long time, his reports were considered too extreme to be believed. The scale of the horror he described was simply beyond the comprehension of the officials who read them. By 1943, Pilecki realized that the Allies were not going to intervene. He also knew that the camp's authorities were closing in on his resistance network. His only option was to escape. On the night of April 26, 1943, he and 2 comrades staged a daring escape from the camp's bakery. After his escape, he wrote a final, comprehensive report on his time in the camp, a document now known as Pilecki's Report. It is a chilling, meticulous, and invaluable historical record. The story of Witold Pilecki is almost beyond belief. It is a story of a courage so profound it is difficult to grasp. He willingly walked into a place that was the epitome of human evil, not to die, but to fight back with the only weapon he had, the truth. His story was largely forgotten for decades, suppressed by the post-war communist government in Poland. Only in recent years has his incredible bravery been fully recognized. His memoir, The Auschwitz Volunteer, is a testament to his spirit. But what drove a man to make such a choice? We know the strategic reasons, but what was the personal human calculation that led him to sacrifice his own freedom and life? How did he maintain his sanity and his sense of mission in a place designed to destroy both? And the most haunting question, how many other secret reports from other brave individuals in other camps were successfully smuggled out only to be lost, ignored, or buried in an archive, their urgent warnings never heeded? Number 13 is a painting worth a human life. War is not just about the destruction of lives. It is also about the destruction of culture. When a bomb falls on a city, it doesn't just kill people. It can erase centuries of history, art, and identity. A regime bent on domination doesn't just want to control territory. It wants to control the story of civilization itself. It does this by destroying the art of its enemies and by stealing the greatest treasures for itself. During the Second World War, Europe was subjected to the largest art theft in history. Masterpieces by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo were looted from museums and private collections and hidden away. In response to this cultural crisis, the Allies formed a special unit. Its official name was the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Program. But they became known as the Monuments Men. They were a most unusual group of soldiers. They weren't young men trained for combat. They were museum directors, curators, art historians, and architects. Most were in their middle age. They were tasked with a seemingly impossible mission to go into the war zones and try to save Europe's cultural heritage from destruction and theft. It was dangerous work. They were often on the front lines trying to prevent damage to historic buildings during combat. They had to navigate the chaos of liberated cities, trying to track down stolen art. As the war came to an end, their mission became a race against time. The retreating forces had hidden vast quantities of stolen art in salt mines, castles, and tunnels across Germany and Austria. And they had issued orders that if the regime fell, all of it was to be destroyed. The Monuments Men had to find these hidden repositories before it was too late. In places like the Altassi salt mine in Austria, they found a breathtaking collection. There were thousands of paintings, sculptures, and tapestries. They found Vermeer's The Astronomer, the Ghent altarpiece by the Van Eyck brothers, and Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna. It was a treasure trove of Western civilization hidden deep underground, wired with explosives. The monuments men, working with local miners, had to carefully and painstakingly remove the artworks and deactivate the bombs. Thanks to their efforts, over 5 million cultural artifacts were recovered and returned to their rightful owners. The story of the Monuments Men, chronicled in the book of the same name by Robert M. Edsel, raises a difficult question. In a war that killed tens of millions of people, why should anyone care about a painting? Is it right to risk a human life to save a statue? The Monuments Men believed the answer was yes. They believed that you could kill a generation of people and they would eventually be replaced. But if you destroy their art, their history, their achievements, you erase them from memory forever. You destroy their very identity. They were fighting not just for the present, but for the past and the future. They were saving the soul of a continent. But how much was lost forever? For every masterpiece they found, how many were destroyed in the fighting or stolen by individuals and never recovered? We know about the famous works, but what about the thousands of smaller, locally important pieces of art that vanished without a trace? And what secrets still lie hidden in forgotten mines or walled-up cellars waiting to be discovered? Number 12. Can art be a weapon of peace? War is usually fought with bullets and bombs, but one of the most unusual and creative units in the U.S. Army during the war fought with a different kind of arsenal: paint, speakers, and inflatable tanks. They were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. Their job was not to kill the enemy, but to deceive them. They were a traveling roadshow of illusion designed to make the enemy think the Allied forces were much larger and in different locations than they actually were. The unit was made up of over 1,000 artists, designers, sound engineers, and actors. They were recruited from art schools and advertising agencies. Their mission was top secret. They used a combination of clever tricks to create their illusions. They had a fleet of inflatable rubber tanks, trucks, and airplanes. From a distance, they looked completely real. They would inflate them under the cover of darkness to make it seem like a large armored division had arrived overnight. Then they would just as quickly deflate them and move on, creating the impression of a fast-moving, powerful force. Sound was another key element. They had giant speakers mounted on trucks that could blast the sounds of a military unit from miles away. They had a library of recordings of everything from troop chatter to the clatter of tank treads and the sounds of bridge construction. They could make a small convoy sound like a massive column on the move. They also used radio deception, creating fake radio traffic with false information for the enemy to intercept. And finally, they had actors who would dress up as generals and staff officers. They would go into local towns, frequent cafes, and deliberately spread false rumors about troop movements, knowing that local spies would overhear them. The Ghost Army's deceptions were remarkably effective. They were involved in over 20 battlefield operations, from the D-Day landings in Normandy to the final push across the Rhine River into Germany. Their illusions are credited with saving thousands of lives. By drawing enemy units away from the real locations of Allied attacks, they created gaps in the lines that could be exploited with fewer casualties. Their story was kept secret for more than 40 years after the war ended, finally declassified in 1996. The documentary, The Ghost Army, brought their incredible story to a wider audience. This is a story about using creativity and ingenuity, not for destruction, but for preservation. The men of the Ghost Army used their artistic talents to trick the enemy into fighting phantoms, saving the lives of real soldiers in the process. It was a form of warfare where the goal was to get the enemy to shoot at nothing. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a bomb, but a clever idea. They waged a war of the imagination, but the secrecy surrounding their operations raises many questions. How many of their missions are still not fully understood or documented? Were there operational failures, deceptions that went wrong, that have been kept quiet to this day? And the most intriguing question, how many German battlefield reports from the time describe strange, phantom armies that appear and disappear, reports that historians may have dismissed as exaggerations or errors, but were actually accurate descriptions of the Ghost Army at work? That's number 11. How can one person's silence hide such a monumental secret? For 50 years, Nicholas Winton was just an ordinary man living a quiet life in England. He worked in finance, got married, and had a family. His children and his wife knew him as a good, humble man. They had no idea that he was carrying one of the most incredible secrets of the entire war. He never spoke about it. It was a chapter of his life that he had closed and put away. Then, in 1988, his wife Gret found an old scrapbook in their attic. It was filled with names, pictures, and documents, and the secret came out. In the winter of 1938, Nicholas Winton was a 29-year-old stockbroker in London. He was about to go on a skiing holiday in Switzerland, but then he got a call from a friend who was working with refugees in Prague, Czechoslovakia. The situation there was desperate. The country was being slowly taken over by the German regime, and thousands of people, especially Jewish families, were trying to flee. His friend said, "I have a most interesting assignment for you. Don't bother bringing your skis." Winton canceled his holiday and went to Prague. What he saw there changed his life. He saw thousands of families living in horrible conditions in refugee camps with winter approaching. He realized that while organizations were trying to help the adults, no one was doing anything for the children. He decided he had to act. Working out of a hotel room in Prague, he set up an ad hoc organization to get the children out. It was a race against time. He knew the borders would soon close for good. He faced a mountain of bureaucracy. He needed to find British families who would agree to foster the children. He needed to raise money for the transport and for the bonds the British government required. He needed to get the permits from both the British and the German authorities. He placed advertisements in British newspapers, and the response was overwhelming. Hundreds of families came forward. He worked tirelessly, forging documents when he had to, bribing officials when necessary. He organized 8 train transports that carried children from Prague through Germany to the safety of London. The first train left on March 14, 1939, the day before German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. He managed to save 669 children. A 9th train, with 250 children on board, was scheduled to leave on September 1st, 1939. It was the largest transport yet, but that was the day Germany invaded Poland and the war began. The train never left the station. All of the children on that train were presumed to have been sent to concentration camps. Nicholas Winton said that for the rest of his life he was haunted by the faces of those 250 children. He never told anyone what he had done. He didn't see himself as a hero. He just saw the 250 he had failed to save. It was only after his wife found the scrapbook that the world learned his story. He was featured on a BBC television program called That's Life. In a now famous and deeply moving segment, the host revealed that the people sitting in the audience around him were some of the very children he had saved, now grown up. Nicholas Winton, an old man by then, was overcome with emotion. The book Nicholas Winton's Lottery of Life tells his story in his own words. But why the half-century of silence? Was it purely humility, or was it also the pain of that last canceled train? How many other quiet heroes are out there, living ordinary lives, their extraordinary acts of wartime courage known only to themselves? And what other secrets, what other scrapbooks filled with names and forgotten histories are still waiting to be found in dusty attics? Number 10. What is the price of a child's ticket to safety? The late 1930s were a time of growing darkness in Central Europe. A violent wave of state-sponsored anti-Semitism culminated in a night of terror in November 1938, known as the Wynne Night of Broken Glass. Synagogues were burned, businesses were destroyed, and thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. It became brutally clear to many families that there was no future for them under the ruling regime. They had to get their children out. In response to this crisis, the British government eased its immigration restrictions for certain categories of refugees. This led to the creation of a rescue mission known as the Kindertransport, or Children's Transport. It was a unique and desperate operation. The plan was to bring thousands of predominantly Jewish children under the age of 17 from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia to safety in Great Britain. But there was a heartbreaking condition. The parents were not allowed to come with them. The Kindertransport was a massive undertaking organized by a coalition of British, Jewish, and Quaker organizations. They had to find British foster families or hostels willing to take in the children. They had to raise funds, as the government required a guarantee of £50 per child to cover their eventual re-emigration. The logistics were staggering. Volunteers in both Britain and on the continent worked around the clock to process applications, arrange travel, and match children with families. For the parents, it was an unimaginable choice. To save their child's life, they had to send them away, alone, to a foreign country with a different language and culture, not knowing if they would ever see them again. The scenes at the train stations were filled with a quiet agony. Parents trying to be brave for their children, giving them last-minute instructions, packing their one small suitcase with their most treasured possessions. The children, many too young to understand what was happening, clutching their identity tags, waving goodbye to their parents from the train window. For most of them, it would be the last time they ever saw their mothers and fathers. Between December 1938 and the start of the war in September 1939, nearly 10,000 children were brought to Great Britain on the Kindertransport. They were met by their new foster families or sent to hostels and farms across the country. Their experiences were varied. Some were welcomed into loving homes. Others faced hardship and loneliness, but they were safe, they survived. The vast majority of the parents they left behind did not. They were murdered in the camps and ghettos that spread across Europe. The Kindertransport is a story of profound sadness and incredible hope. It is a story of the terrible choices parents had to make and the generosity of strangers who opened their homes. It shows a moment when a government and a society chose to act, however imperfectly, to save the most vulnerable. Many of the children who came on the Kindertransport went on to live remarkable lives, becoming scientists, artists, and leaders in their fields, like the Nobel laureate Walter Kohn. The memory of the transports is preserved in memorials like the Kindertransport, the Arrival sculpture at Liverpool Street Station in London, the place where so many of the children first set foot on British soil. But the story is filled with haunting unknowns. What happened to the children who were approved for transport but couldn't get out before the war started? How many parents were just days or hours away from securing a place for their child when the borders slammed shut? And what psychological scars did the survivors carry with them for the rest of their lives, caught between gratitude for their rescue and the lifelong grief for the families they lost? Number 9, can a man who refuses to kill be the greatest hero on the battlefield? The battlefield is a place that demands violence. A soldier's job is to fight, to kill, and to survive. To refuse to carry a weapon in a combat zone seems like madness. It's a rejection of the fundamental rule of war. But one man did just that. And in doing so, he became one of the most decorated heroes of the entire war. His name was Desmond Doss. Doss was a Seventh-day Adventist. His faith was deeply important to him. He believed that the Ten Commandments, including "Thou shalt not kill," were absolute. When the United States entered the war, he felt a duty to serve his country, but he could not reconcile that duty with his conscience. He enlisted in the army, but he registered as a conscientious objector. He was willing to be a medic, to save lives, but he refused to even touch a rifle. His decision was not popular. In the hyper-masculine world of the army, he was seen as a coward. His fellow soldiers in the 77th Infantry Division mocked him, threatened him, and tried to have him discharged. They threw their boots at him while he prayed. They called him a disgrace. His commanding officers tried to force him out, declaring him mentally unfit for service. But Doss refused to quit. He believed his place was with the men on the front lines, helping the wounded. His moment of truth came in the spring of 1945, during the Battle of Okinawa. His unit was ordered to take a heavily fortified escarpment known as the Maeda Escarpment, or Hacksaw Ridge. It was a brutal, bloody fight. The American forces took the top of the cliff, but then faced a ferocious counterattack. The casualties were horrific. The remaining soldiers were ordered to retreat back down the cliff face. But, Doss stayed behind. He was alone, on top of the ridge, surrounded by the dead and wounded, with enemy soldiers still in the area. He could have retreated to safety, but he didn't. He heard the cries of the wounded men, his comrades, the same men who had tormented him. He began to pray, "Lord, please help me get one more." And then he went to work. One by one, he found the wounded soldiers, treated their injuries, and dragged them to the edge of the cliff. He then single-handedly lowered them down to safety using a rope and pulley system he devised. For hours, he worked under constant fire. Each time he lowered a man to safety, he would repeat his prayer, "Please, Lord, help me get one more." He lost count of how many he saved. When he was finally rescued, exhausted, and wounded himself, he had saved an estimated 75 men. For his incredible bravery, Desmond Doss was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. He was the first conscientious objector to ever receive it. His story is told in the book Redemption at Hacksaw Ridge and the film Hacksaw Ridge. The story of Desmond Doss challenges our very definition of courage. It shows that bravery is not just about the willingness to kill, but also the unwavering commitment to save. His strength came not from a weapon, but from his faith and his conviction. He proved that a man could be the bravest soldier on the field without ever firing a single shot. But what gave him the physical and mental strength to continue for so many hours under such terrifying conditions? We know about his prayer, but what other thoughts went through his mind as he moved from one wounded soldier to another? Were there men he couldn't save, and did their faces haunt him as much as the ones he did? And how did his relationship with his fellow soldiers change after that day? The men who once called him a coward now owed him their lives. Number 8. When faith is used to divide, can it also unite? The war created stark divisions. People were separated by nationality, ideology, and religion. The regime that occupied much of Europe was built on a foundation of hate, particularly directed at its Jewish citizens. But in the middle of occupied Paris, one of the city's most sacred places became an unlikely sanctuary, a place where the lines between faiths blurred in the name of humanity. That place was the Grand Mosque of Paris. The mosque was led by its rector, Si Kaddour Bengabrit. He was an influential and well-respected figure in the city. And as the persecution of Jews in Paris intensified, Bengabrit and other leaders at the mosque made a courageous decision. They decided to use the mosque as a shelter for those fleeing the authorities. It was a quiet, secret operation. The mosque's unique architecture, with its winding corridors, hidden courtyards, and underground passages, made it an ideal hiding place. The mosque began providing forged birth certificates and identity papers that identified Jewish individuals as Muslim. This was a life-saving deception. With a Muslim identity card, a person could move more freely and avoid arrest and deportation. The mosque network provided these documents to hundreds of people, including many children who were hidden within the mosque's walls. They also provided shelter for escaped Allied airmen and members of the French resistance. It was an act of interfaith solidarity in a time of extreme religious persecution. The Muslim leaders of the mosque saw the Jewish people not as members of a different religion, but as fellow people of the book, and as human beings in desperate need of help. They understood that the ideology of the occupiers was a threat to everyone who believed in freedom and compassion. They risked their own lives to uphold the most basic tenets of their faith, to protect the vulnerable, and to offer sanctuary to those in need. The exact number of people saved by the Grand Mosque of Paris is unknown. Because the operation was so secret, few records were kept. Estimates range from a few hundred to over 1,000. The story remained largely untold for decades. It was first brought to wider attention by the film Les Hommes Libres, Free Men. While the film takes some dramatic liberties, the core of the story is true. It is a powerful example of how people of different faiths can come together to resist a common evil. It reminds us that at its best, religion can be a powerful force for good. It can inspire acts of incredible courage and self-sacrifice. In a city filled with fear and betrayal, the Grand Mosque of Paris was an oasis of hope, a place where the shared values of humanity triumphed over the manufactured hatreds of the state. But the secrecy of the operation leaves us with so many unanswered questions. What was the full extent of the rescue network? Who else was involved? How did they manage to get the supplies to print the forged documents without being discovered? And what was the true nature of Si Kaddour Bengabrit's relationship with the occupying authorities? He was a skilled diplomat who walked a dangerous tightrope, maintaining a cordial public relationship with the occupiers while secretly subverting their murderous plans. What other secrets did he take to his grave? Number 7. What happens when women defy a regime on its own streets? Public protest in a totalitarian state is almost unthinkable. The power of the state is absolute. Dissent is crushed without mercy. To speak out is to invite arrest, torture, or death. And yet, in February 1943, in the very heart of the German capital, a protest erupted. It was led by a group of people the regime had long dismissed as weak and unimportant women. The protest took place on a street called Rosenstrasse. It was the site of a community building that had been converted into a temporary detention center. The secret police had just conducted a major roundup of the last remaining Jews in Berlin. Among those arrested were about 2,000 Jewish men who were married to non-Jewish German women. These so-called mixed marriages had, until this point, offered some protection from deportation. But now, that protection was gone. The men were being held at the Rosenstrasse building, waiting to be sent to concentration camps. When the wives of these men learned where their husbands were being held, they began to gather outside the building. At first there were just a few, then more came. Soon there were hundreds and then thousands of women standing vigil on the street day and night in the freezing winter weather. They were unarmed, they were ordinary women, housewives, factory workers, mothers, and they were demanding the release of their husbands. They stood there for a week, they chanted, "Give us our husbands back." The secret police tried to disperse them. They set up machine guns in the street, threatening to shoot, but the women did not leave. They would scatter when the guards charged, but then they would regroup and continue their protest. It was an astonishing act of collective civil disobedience. These women, who had been raised to be obedient and loyal to the state, were now openly defying it on its own turf. Their protest was fueled by love and a fierce determination not to let their families be destroyed. And then the unthinkable happened. The regime blinked. After a week of non-stop protests, the authorities released the men. It was a small but stunning victory. The protest on Rosenstrasse was one of the only public demonstrations against the persecution of the Jews that happened inside Germany during the war. The historian Nathan Stoltzfus, in his book Resistance of the Heart, argues that the regime backed down because the protest was too public. It was happening in the middle of Berlin, and it was being led by women who were considered Aryan. To open fire on them would have created a public relations disaster and undermined morale on the home front. The story of the Rosenstrasse protest is a powerful reminder that even the most monolithic and terrifying regimes are not invincible. It shows that ordinary people, when they act together with courage and conviction, can make a difference. These women had no weapons, they only had their voices and their love for their families, and for one brief, remarkable week, that was enough. But so much about this event is still debated by historians. What was the exact internal debate within the regime's leadership that led to the decision to release the men? Were they truly swayed by the protest, or were there other more pragmatic reasons? Why did this protest succeed when so many other acts of resistance failed so tragically? And what happened to the women of Rosenstrasse after the protest? Did their act of defiance mark them for future retribution, or were they able to melt back into the anonymity of the city? Number 6. How many lives is one career worth? In the summer of 1940, the city of Kaunas, Lithuania, was a city of fear. It was caught between two powerful and ruthless totalitarian regimes. Thousands of refugees, many of them Jewish families who had fled the invasion of Poland, were now trapped. Their only hope was to get a visa to travel east, through the Soviet Union, to another part of the world. But getting those visas was nearly impossible. The embassies and consulates were closing down, the doors to the world were slamming shut. One of the last remaining diplomatic outposts was the Japanese consulate. It was run by a man named Chiune Sugihara. He was a career diplomat, a man who had been trained to follow orders and obey the rules of his government. But in July 1940, a crowd of desperate refugees began to gather outside his consulate. They had heard a rumor that a Japanese transit visa, combined with a dubious end visa to the Dutch Caribbean island of Curaçao, could be their ticket to freedom. They pleaded with Sugihara for help. Sugihara was in a difficult position. He cabled his superiors in Tokyo 3 times, asking for permission to issue the visas. 3 times, the answer came back no. He was ordered not to issue visas to anyone who did not meet the strict requirements, which almost none of the refugees did. Sugihara was faced with a choice. He could obey his orders, protect his career, and abandon the people outside his gate. Or he could defy his government, risk his future, and do what he believed was right. He chose to do what was right. He and his wife Yukiko stayed up night after night for weeks, handwriting visas. They worked for 18 to 20 hours a day. Sugihara knew he was in a race against time. The consulate was scheduled to close. He wrote visas until his hands were cramped and sore. He ignored the orders from Tokyo. He knew he was committing an act of professional suicide, but he kept writing. Even on the day he was forced to leave Kaunas, as his train was pulling out of the station, he was still writing visas and throwing them out of the window to the desperate people running alongside the tracks. It is estimated that Chiune Sugihara issued thousands of transit visas. These visas for life allowed entire families to escape Europe. The exact number of people he saved is unknown, but it is thought to be around 6,000. After the war, Sugihara was dismissed from the Japanese Foreign Service. He was disgraced. He lived in obscurity for many years, working odd jobs to support his family. He never spoke of what he had done. It was only decades later, when one of the people he had saved finally tracked him down, that his story became known. The story of Chiune Sugihara, told in books like In Search of Sugihara, is a profound lesson in moral courage. It's about a man who, when faced with a choice between his duty to his government and his duty to humanity, chose humanity. He was not a soldier or a spy, he was a bureaucrat. But his weapon was a simple ink pen, and with it, he fought a powerful battle against indifference and saved thousands of lives. But what gave him the strength to defy his government's direct orders? We know his wife supported him, but was there anyone else in the diplomatic community who secretly encouraged him? How many of the Sugihara survivors never knew the name of the man who saved them, holding onto a visa with a signature they couldn't read? And the most chilling question, how many other diplomats in other cities received similar pleas for help and chose to follow their orders, their moment of decision forever unrecorded? Number 5, can a lie save thousands of lives? In the small town of Rozwadów in occupied Poland, 2 doctors were fighting a desperate battle. Their names were Eugeniusz Lazowski and Stanislaw Matulewicz. They were watching as their community was being slowly destroyed. The occupying forces were regularly rounding up young people and sending them to forced labor camps in Germany, from which many never returned. The town's Jewish population had already been forced into a ghetto, and the doctors knew their fate would be even worse. They felt helpless. They wanted to do something, anything, to stop the brutality. Then Dr. Matulewicz had a brilliant idea. He had discovered something interesting during his medical research. He found that if you injected a healthy person with a dead strain of the Proteus bacteria, they would not get sick, but they would test positive for epidemic typhus. Typhus was a dreaded disease. It was highly contagious and often fatal. The German authorities were terrified of it. An outbreak in a town could disrupt their war effort. They had a strict policy: if a typhus epidemic was confirmed in a Polish town, they would quarantine it. They would put up signs, forbid any Germans from entering, and halt all transports out of the area. The 2 doctors saw their chance. They began a secret campaign of medical deception. They would inject their non-Jewish Polish patients who were showing any signs of illness with the dead bacteria. Then they would take a blood sample and send it to the German-controlled labs for testing. The results, of course, came back positive for typhus. As more and more cases were reported, the German health authorities became alarmed. Soon, they declared a full-blown epidemic in Rozwadów and the surrounding villages. The town was officially quarantined. It was a dangerous game. If their deception was discovered, they would have been executed immediately. They lived in constant fear. At one point, a team of German medical inspectors was sent to investigate. The doctors had to think fast. They hosted the inspectors, fed them a large meal with plenty of vodka, and then took them to a specially prepared hospital filled with their sickest-looking but non-typhus patients. The German doctors, wary of catching the disease and perhaps a little drunk, did a quick and superficial inspection and left, confirming the epidemic. The quarantine lasted for nearly 2 years. During that time, no one from Rozwadów was sent to a forced labor camp. The town's ghetto was also inside the quarantine zone. While the doctors' fake epidemic could not save the Jewish population from their ultimate fate at the hands of special extermination squads, it is believed to have delayed their deportation and saved many from the labor camps. In total, it is estimated that Dr. Lazowski and Dr. Matulewicz saved around 8,000 people from being deported. Their story is detailed in Lazowski's memoir, Prywatna Wojna, My Private War. This is a story about using science and intelligence as weapons of resistance. It's about 2 men who fought a regime, not with guns, but with a syringe and a clever lie. They saved their community by creating a phantom plague. It was an act of profound courage and humanitarianism hidden behind a mask of medical data. But how did they maintain the deception for so long without anyone in the community breaking the secret? Were there other doctors in on the plan, and what was the psychological toll on the 2 men living every day with the fear of a knock on the door that would mean their execution? The most incredible question is whether similar medical deceptions were attempted in other parts of occupied Europe. Their stories yet to be discovered. Number 4, is a pamphlet more powerful than a sword? In 1942, at the University of Munich, a small group of students and a professor decided they could no longer remain silent. They saw their country was committing, they saw the lies of the propaganda, the persecution of their neighbors, and the senseless slaughter of the war. They knew they had to do something, but what could they do? They were just students. They had no army, no weapons. All they had were their minds, their conscience, and a typewriter. They decided to fight a war of words. They called themselves the White Rose. The core of the group included siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl, Christoph Probst, Alexander Schmorell, Willy Graf, and a professor, Kurt Huber. They began to write, print, and distribute leaflets that called for resistance against the regime. Their pamphlets were not simple slogans. They were deeply intellectual and philosophical, quoting from Schiller, Goethe, and the Bible. They spoke of freedom, honor, and moral responsibility. They tried to awaken the conscience of the German people. Their first leaflet began with the powerful words, "Nothing is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition by an irresponsible clique that has yielded to base instinct." They printed thousands of copies. They left them in phone booths, mailed them to random addresses, and took them by train to other cities to distribute. It was incredibly dangerous work. The state had eyes and ears everywhere. To be caught with such a leaflet was a death sentence. For months, the White Rose operated in secret, their leaflets appearing like intellectual bombshells across southern Germany. They were a voice of reason in a chorus of madness. They were a reminder that not all Germans were complicit, that there were still people who believed in a different, more humane Germany. They were young people who risked everything for an idea. Sophie Scholl in particular became a symbol of this courageous resistance. She was known for her intelligence, her bravery, and her unwavering moral clarity. In February 1943, Hans and Sophie Scholl took a suitcase full of their sixth leaflet to the University of Munich. They left stacks of them outside the lecture halls just as the classes were ending. Sophie impulsively pushed a final stack of leaflets off a high balcony, sending them fluttering down into the main hall. A janitor saw them and reported them to the secret police. Hans and Sophie were arrested along with Christoph Probst. They were subjected to an intense interrogation and a show trial. They refused to betray their comrades. They took full responsibility for their actions. Sophie's last words before her execution were, "Such a fine sunny day and I have to go. What does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" They were all executed by guillotine just days after their arrest. The other members of the group were later rounded up and also executed. The state thought it had crushed the White Rose, but it was wrong. A copy of their sixth leaflet was smuggled out of Germany to the Allies. That summer, millions of copies were dropped by Allied planes all over Germany. The students' words, which the regime had tried to silence, were now raining down from the sky. The story is powerfully told in books, like The White Rose Munich, 1942 to 1943. But what if that janitor had not seen them? Could the White Rose have continued its work, and would it have inspired a wider resistance movement? How many people read their leaflets and were secretly moved, but were too afraid to act? And what of the countless smaller acts of intellectual resistance, the secret diaries, the banned books read by candlelight, whose stories will never be known? Number 3. How do you count the lives you've saved when you've lost the list? In the city of Warsaw, over 400,000 Jewish people were sealed into a tiny, walled-off area known as the ghetto. The conditions were horrific. Starvation and disease were rampant. It was a place designed for death. But inside this hell, a small group of people were fighting a secret war to save the most vulnerable, the children. One of their most courageous and effective leaders was a young Polish social worker. Her name was Irina Sendler. Sendler was not Jewish. She was a Catholic woman who had been raised to despise injustice. Before the war, she had worked in the social welfare department, helping the poor and disenfranchised. When the ghetto was created, she was horrified. She knew she had to do something. She joined Zagota, the Polish underground council to aid Jews. She became the head of its children's section. Her mission was to smuggle Jewish children out of the ghetto and find them safe hiding places on the Aryan side of the city. It was an incredibly complex and dangerous operation. First, she had to convince the parents to part with their children. This was a heart-wrenching task. The parents knew they might be sending their child away forever, but they also knew it was their only chance for survival. Then Sendler and her network had to find ways to get the children out. They used every method imaginable. They carried babies out in toolboxes and sacks. They sedated older children and hid them in coffins or crates on carts. They used the old city courthouse, which had an entrance in the ghetto and an exit on the other side. They even used the city's sewer system, guiding children through the dark and filthy tunnels to freedom. Once a child was out, the work was not over. They needed a new identity, forged documents, and a safe place to live. Sendler's network placed the children with Polish families in convents and in orphanages. It was a constant struggle to find enough homes and enough money to support the children. And Sandler was at the center of it all, coordinating the efforts, keeping the records. She had a system. For every child she saved, she wrote down their real name and their new false identity on a small piece of tissue paper. She wanted to make sure that after the war, the children could be reunited with any surviving relatives and could know their true heritage. She kept these precious lists in a glass jar, which she buried under an apple tree in a friend's garden. In October 1943, the authorities came for her. She was arrested, imprisoned, and brutally tortured, but she never gave up the names of her co-conspirators or the locations of the children. She was sentenced to death, but the Polish underground managed to bribe a guard, and on the day of her execution, she was listed as executed and secretly released. She spent the rest of the war in hiding, but she continued her work. It is estimated that Irina Sendler and her network saved the lives of 2,500 children. Her story, long hidden, is now told in books like Irina's Children. After the war, she dug up the jars. She tried to find the children and reconnect them with their past, but almost all of their parents had been murdered in the death camps. For many years, her heroism was not recognized by the communist government in Poland. She lived a quiet life, always feeling that she had not done enough. But so many questions remain. How many other helpers were in her network? Their names unrecorded, their bravery unknown. What was the true fate of all 2,500 children she saved? Her list was crucial, but how many other such lists from other rescuers in other cities were lost or destroyed, leaving thousands of survivors with no way to ever know their original names or the families they came from? Number 2, when the army is trapped, who comes to the rescue? In May 1940, the war in Europe was going badly for the Allies. The German army had swept through France and the Low Countries with terrifying speed. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian troops, had been pushed back to the coast. They were trapped in a small pocket around the French port of Dunkirk. Their backs were to the English Channel. The enemy was closing in. It seemed like a catastrophe was inevitable. The capture or destruction of over 300,000 soldiers would have been a devastating blow, perhaps even a fatal one. The Royal Navy began a desperate evacuation effort, codenamed Operation Dynamo. But the large naval destroyers could not get close to the shallow beaches where thousands of soldiers were waiting. They were easy targets for air attacks. The piers at the port were being bombed relentlessly. It quickly became clear that the Navy alone could not save the army. They needed more boats. They needed smaller boats that could get right up to the shore and ferry soldiers out to the larger ships. An urgent call went out. It was a call to the people of Britain. The government requisitioned every seaworthy vessel they could find, and the people responded. A most extraordinary civilian navy was assembled. It became known as the Little Ships of Dunkirk. They came from all along the coast of England. There were fishing boats, private yachts, pleasure cruisers, lifeboats, and Thames River barges. They were sailed not by naval officers, but by their civilian owners, fishermen, lawyers, bus drivers, and factory workers. Some were old men, some were teenage boys. They sailed across the dangerous waters of the English Channel into a war zone. They faced enemy air attacks, naval mines, and artillery fire. They navigated the chaotic and smoke-filled waters off the coast of Dunkirk. They pulled up to the beaches, and the long lines of waiting soldiers waded out to them. They packed their small boats with as many men as they could hold and then ferried them out to the destroyers waiting in deeper water. Some of the little ships even made the journey all the way back to England themselves over and over again. Over the course of 9 days, this bizarre and heroic flotilla, a mix of gray warships and brightly colored pleasure boats, rescued an incredible number of men. In total, over 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk. It was not a victory, it was a miraculous escape. But it was an escape that saved the British Army and allowed it to fight another day. It became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. The spirit of the little ships, the idea of a nation coming together to save its own, became a powerful symbol of resilience and defiance. The story has been told many times, including in Walter Lord's book, The Miracle of Dunkirk. It was a moment when the line between civilian and soldier completely disappeared. It was a rescue mission powered by ordinary people in their ordinary boats, performing an extraordinary act of bravery. They were not ordered to go. They chose to go. They saw their countrymen in trouble, and they went to help. But the history of this event is still incomplete. How many of the little ships were sunk, and how many of their civilian crew were killed? The records are patchy. What was the experience like for the individual fishermen and yachtsmen sailing their familiar boats into the hell of a modern battlefield? And what happened to the thousands of French soldiers who stayed behind to hold the perimeter, sacrificing themselves so that the evacuation could succeed? Their story is often overshadowed by the miracle of the rescue. Number one in the sky, with the enemy in your sights, what makes you see a man instead of a target? It was December 20th, 1943. A young American pilot named Charlie Brown was on his first combat mission. He was the pilot of a B-17 bomber called Ye Old Pub. His target was an aircraft factory in Bremen, Germany. The mission was a disaster. The plane was badly damaged by anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. One of the engines was out. The hydraulic and oxygen systems were gone. The radio was destroyed. The tail gunner was dead, and most of the crew were wounded. The bomber was flying alone, riddled with holes, barely able to stay in the air. As Brown struggled to fly his crippled plane back towards England, a German fighter pilot appeared on his tail. His name was Franz Stigler. He was an ace pilot, just one victory away from earning Germany's highest military honor. The shattered American bomber was an easy target. It was a sitting duck. Stigler moved in for the kill. But as he got closer, he saw something that made him hesitate. He could see the dead tail gunner. He could see the wounded crew members inside the fuselage trying to help each other. He could see the terror and shock on the face of the pilot, Charlie Brown. Stigler was a veteran pilot. He had been taught an unwritten code of honor by one of his first commanding officers. The officer had told him, "You fight by the rules of war for your side, but you never forget that you are a human being." One of those rules was, you do not shoot down a man in a parachute. As Stigler looked at the helpless B-17, he felt that shooting it down would be the same as shooting a man in a parachute. It wouldn't be a fight, it would be an execution. He made a decision. He pulled his fighter plane up alongside the bomber. The American crew stared in disbelief. They thought he was toying with them before the final attack. But Stigler was trying to communicate. He pointed down, trying to get Brown to land his plane in Germany. Brown shook his head. Stigler then pointed towards neutral Sweden, but Brown didn't understand. Finally, Stigler realized the only way to save the crew was to escort them out of German airspace. He flew his plane in formation with the bomber, shielding it from other German anti-aircraft batteries on the ground. Once they were over the North Sea and safely out of danger, Stigler gave Brown a salute, and then peeled away and returned to his base. He never reported the incident. If his superiors had found out he had let an enemy plane escape, he would have been shot. But Charlie Brown managed to fly his plane back to England and land it safely. He reported the incident, but his superiors told him to keep quiet. They didn't want to create any positive stories about the enemy. For over 40 years, both men carried the secret of what happened that day. Charlie Brown spent years searching for the German pilot who had saved him and his crew. Finally, in 1990, he found him. Franz Stigler was living in Canada. The two men met. They became close friends, like brothers, for the rest of their lives. Their incredible story is told in the book, A Higher Call. This was not a moment that changed the war. It was a secret held between two men, but it is perhaps the ultimate story of humanity amidst the chaos. It's a story about a moment when a pilot, trained to kill, looked into the eyes of his enemy and saw not a target but another human being. In that moment of recognition, he chose mercy over honor, compassion over duty. It was an act of grace that transcended the hatred and violence of the war. It was a whisper of peace in a sky filled with thunder. But how many other moments like this happened, high in the clouds or deep in a forest, secrets that were never told and died with the men who shared them? Was this code of honor? Stigler followed more widespread among pilots than the official histories let on. And the final, most profound question, what would we have done? In that cockpit, with the enemy in our sights, would we have seen a uniform or would we have seen a man?